What If God Were an Alien? Written by Archangel, narrated by Drew Henderson. Introduction. I am saying this right up front. I am an atheist. Does this mean I am certain there is no God? For me, it doesn't. I don't think that anyone can be absolutely certain of this, not even Richard Dawkins. I will certainly say that the probability of the existence of any God that meets any reasonable definition of the term seems pretty low, and the probability that there is a God that is anything like the major world religions propose is even smaller. Let's try to put these probabilities in perspective, relative to other things we know about the world. Most of what we think we know from science is uncertain too. Over time, science very often progresses by showing that things we thought were true before were not quite right. But some things seem more certain than others. How certain are we that the sun will rise tomorrow morning? I don't know the exact number, but I would say that this is pretty nearly certain. More certain than that there is no God? I would say yes. Now consider, for example, Einstein's general theory of relativity. You don't have to know much about this theory to know how highly regarded it is by scientists. It has been shown by many experiments to be correct, and yet it is almost certainly wrong at extremely small length scales. We don't have a better theory to replace it yet, so for now we can think of it as right. But I would rate the probability that there is no God as higher than the probability that Einstein was exactly right. So this should give you some idea that I am pretty certain, but not absolutely certain, that there is no God. Commonly, people who are uncertain about the existence of God call themselves agnostic. In part, this is because it is more socially acceptable. In a mostly religious world, it is risky to tell people that they are outright wrong. But at least in the Western world, it is acceptable to have doubts. To be agnostic is to say that you are not going to challenge anyone's beliefs. But perhaps the time has come for more people to start challenging religious beliefs. Sam Harris is responsible, at least in part, for convincing me of this. It is not my purpose here to explain why it is so important to challenge religion. Mr. Harris has done that far more eloquently than I could hope to do. But it very much is my purpose to, in fact, challenge religion, and to do it in a way that I think may be a little different than others have tried. So this is part of the reason that I call myself an atheist without hesitation. But it is not yet the most important reason. If we leave aside the social issue, and we admit that it would be foolish to assert with certainty that there is no God, then what is the difference between an atheist and an agnostic? Is it just a matter of degree? If so, where do you draw the line? I would like to suggest that an atheist is someone who has a different attitude about the possibility of God. If you come to me with evidence that there is a God, how should I respond? Should I, A, start going to church every Sunday, B, learn meditation so that I can contact God myself, or C, study the evidence, and, if it seems compelling, then try to figure out what sort of God this is? If you said C, then you are my kind of atheist. If you said A, then I am curious to know why you think I should leap to the conclusion that the evidence will favor a Christian God. Furthermore, why do you want me to worship something that I still know nothing about? I have never understood the psychology behind the worship of anything with power, whether it be a king or a god. It seems to me instead that anything that demands worship is probably not deserving of worship. Furthermore, it seems to me that the Judeo-Christian God is an especially grim creature who has done little or nothing worthy of praise, and plenty that is not. Christopher Hitchens explains in detail the evident unpleasantness of most of the world's major religions. Let me hasten to point out that my purpose here is not to criticize religions in this way, although it may seem that way at times. Criticism tends to close the mind and raise the natural level of resistance to change. Instead, my plan is to use elements of existing religions as evidence for the existence of God, and then to see what that leads us to think about what such a God is like. Now, if you have seen discussions like this before, you will know where I am going with this. You will say, you are going to study God using science and logic. Many eminent philosophers, mostly theologians, but even some reputable scientists, argue that this is impossible because God is, in effect, not part of the natural world. Even the eminent Stephen Jay Gould has tried to make science and religion compatible by saying that they are different ways of knowing. Many people find these arguments compelling because they do indeed feel a kind of certainty about God that is not based on any actual evidence. Curiously, this kind of certainty is itself a form of evidence and can be studied as such. Some recent research has begun to address the mechanisms which support this sort of certainty, as well as its evolutionary and psychological underpinnings. In any case, I have never been able to make any sense of these arguments about God and religion occupying a different domain of discourse. It is one of my main goals in writing this to explain why this is so, and, if possible, to convince you that there is only one meaningful domain of discourse. I'll summarize the argument here, but there is an entire chapter devoted to this topic later, and, in a way, the entire book is really devoted to this topic. The idea is simple. If we can observe it, it is part of the natural world. If we can't observe it, it may still exist, but it is irrelevant. If God came to earth and started performing miracles, then everyone would agree that this is evidence that we could study in a scientific way. There would be some who assert that we should not or must not do this, but even they would agree that we could. But what about religious experiences that are only in the mind? You may argue that the mind, or some part of the mind, is not in the natural world. But if you have had a religious experience, then you can talk about it. You may find it difficult to articulate exactly how it felt, but I can ask you questions about it, and there is no part of it that would not be accessible in this way. Thus, your mind is also part of the natural world and is accessible to study using science and logic. This doesn't mean that you have to study it that way, only that you can. So I'll leave you with that thought for now and hope it will encourage you to read on. Perhaps you are starting to wonder what this book has to do with space aliens. That is the main title after all. You will soon find out. The first chapter is mainly about space aliens. Furthermore, space aliens keep coming up in later chapters as well. There have been many suggestions over recent years to the effect that space aliens of the distant past may have been responsible for A. bringing life to Earth, B. bringing humans to Earth, C. staying here and becoming humans, D. staying just long enough to plant the idea of God in the minds of primitive humans, and so on. I will not be making any suggestions of this sort. Instead, the reason I like to talk about space aliens is to get you to think about what God does, assuming you believe in God. I claim that many people have thought more about what space aliens do than about what God does. Presumably, everyone agrees that if space aliens came to Earth, or if they are already here, then they do something that is, in principle, observable. Certainly, in popular depictions, they are always observable, even if all they do is take over the minds of other people. So, the fundamental question I want to ask is this. If a space alien came to Earth, how would you know it wasn't God? Your first reaction might be, that's ridiculous, or blasphemous. God is not a space alien. But you would still have to explain, to me, how you would tell the difference, and in the process we would learn something about what God is like. Then, as we go on through later chapters, and we explore the different things that people may think God does, we will constantly raise the question, could a space alien be doing this? In the final analysis, you may accuse me of simply renaming God to be space alien. So be it. I got you to think about what God does in the process. Mission accomplished. I am not really trying to convince you that God actually is a space alien. So, who am I to be writing about space aliens and God? What are my credentials? Am I famous for anything, so that I think you should pay attention to me? Am I trained in philosophy, or theology, or perhaps psychology? Perhaps I am a science fiction writer. I am none of these things. Perhaps you think I am some kind of nut you would see at a science fiction convention or at an alien abduction meeting. I am not that either. At least I am not that kind of nut anyway. Instead, I am just the guy next door or the guy across the bar. I am hopeful that you may be drawn in by my way of thinking and not be distracted by whether I am famous for something else. I do hope you find that my way of thinking about God is helpful and complementary to some of the other God books that have been published recently. Perhaps the actual philosophers and theologians will find it naive relative to other works in their fields. Then they might correct me, and we will all have more to think about.